Hey, Mr. P here. In this video we're going to talk about the properties of water. So in the last video we talked about bonding, we talked about atomic structure, we talked what it meant to be a molecule and an atom and a compound, and so now we're going to kind of talk about the application of atomic structure. We're going to talk about the application of bonding, specifically hydrogen bonding, and how the hydrogen bonding and even the covalent bonding within a water molecule helps to keep a water molecule polar, and why polarity within the context of water is so important and so beneficial, leading into the properties of water. So let's jump in. So, properties of water. Right off the bat, we have 5 properties of water that I want to focus on. We have polarity, cohesion, adhesion, capillary action, and heat capacity. We're going to talk about every single one of these properties of water and really kind of identify why the water has that particular property and how that particular property affects living things. So, polarity. Polarity literally means that the water molecule has poles. So I want to think about it in terms of poles. Just like the Earth has a North Pole and a South Pole, water molecules have poles as well. And it's not necessarily locations that we need to think about like the North Pole and South Pole, but a difference between the charges of those particular poles. And so when you look at a water molecule, there is a partial negative charge and there is a partial positive charge. The reason that these partial charges exist is the sheer fact that the oxygen atom that makes up the bulk of a particular water molecule has more mass and therefore more pull on the shared electrons. Okay? Think of it like this. If the atomic number of oxygen is 8 and the atomic number of hydrogen is 1, then you can kind of think about it like this atom is essentially 8 times larger than the hydrogen atom. And we know from our own solar system that a planet that is 8 times larger then another planet is going to have more gravity, it's going to have more mass, it's going to have more pull, and it's just going to be a stronger entity within the context of the solar system. And so this oxygen atom has more pull and therefore pulls harder on these particular shared electrons. These are electrons and they are shared between the oxygen and the hydrogen. This is a covalent bond. This is a covalent bond. The electrons are shared. We talked about what that means in the last video. If you are a little bit confused, go back and watch. But the oxygen is pulling on these electrons harder, and so you'll therefore see that these electrons are actually sitting closer to the oxygen nucleus. And so if we looked at the actual distance between the electrons and the nucleus, that distance is actually shorter than the distance between the hydrogen nucleus and the electrons. Okay, if we were to measure this is shorter distance than this. So the electrons are actually spending more time and are actually more closely associated with this particular atom than they are with this one. Therefore, giving this particular pole, this side of the water molecule, a slightly negative charge because the negativity is more closely associated with that side of the molecule. And conversely, if what is in this nucleus is a single proton, and we know that protons have positive charges, if what's in this nucleus is a single proton, then obviously these sides of the water molecule are going to have a slightly positive pull because the negativity, or the electrons that are supposed to be surrounding this molecule or this atom, are actually being pulled closer to the oxygen, like I said before. So the hydrogen side of the water molecule is said to be slightly positive. It's not fully positive, it is only slightly positive. And the oxygen side is slightly negative. Okay? Now, how does that relate to other water molecules? So we know that the water molecule as a whole has poles. There's a slightly negative pole and a slightly positive pole. That's what polarity means. And so when you look at, kind of zoom out and look at a bunch of water molecules, you see that the slightly positive side is actually going to orient itself to the slightly negative side of an adjacent water molecule. creating a bond between those two poles, okay, because opposites attract, so a slightly positive pole is going to attract to a slightly negative, slightly positive is going to attract to a slightly negative, slightly positive attract to a slightly negative, slightly positive attract to a slightly negative, and it's the polarity of the water molecule that creates the uneven distribution of charges that results in the hydrogen bonding. Every single one of these little dotted lines is a hydrogen bond. And I know I said in the last video that I was going to discuss hydrogen bonding in more detail, which is why I didn't in the last video, and that's because I knew that this video was coming. And so these are hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are formed between a hydrogen and something else. Okay? That's polarity. Now, polarity leads to these properties, cohesion and adhesion. Okay? So it's because water is a polar molecule, it can form multiple hydrogen bonds, which you can see here. Here's a hydrogen bond, H bond, H bond, H bond, which accounts for many of water's special properties. It's because of water's polarity that cohesion and adhesion and capillary action and the heat capacity exist. Okay? Without polarity, none of these would happen, or none of these would exist. So, what is cohesion? Cohesion is the ability of water to stick to other water molecules. And what is the reason why water can stick to other water molecules? It's because of the hydrogen bonding. All of these little dotted lines are hydrogen bonds. We know that hydrogen bonds exist between the slightly positive and the slightly negative pole. Okay, you will always see a slightly positive and negative interacting. Every single one of those are H bonds. Okay, so hydrogen bonds. We can see that here. We can see it here. We can see it here. We can see it here. Okay, and water molecules would just continually bond to other water molecules, which is why when you wash your car or you go out into the grass in a on a cool morning, you will see dew, but water molecules actually stick to other water molecules, which is the reason why water creates droplets. All of the water molecules want to stick to each other, and they all pool together to create a mass of liquid water, and it's called cohesion, and it's directly related to the water molecules being polar and related to the property of water known as polarity. Adhesion is very similar. It still has to do with polarity. It still has to do with opposite charges attracting, but adhesion is when water sticks to non-water substances. Okay, you can see that here in this picture. So the water droplet that is formed is an example of cohesion because water sticks to water to create the drop, but the fact that the water drop as a whole is sticking to the spider web in all of these individual different situations or places is an example of adhesion because water can stick to non-water substances based on those unequal distribution of charges. Another perfect example of adhesion is with the idea of a meniscus. Okay, you know that when you put water into a graduated cylinder, it actually creates a bend, partially due to gravity, which is pulling the middle down, but it's due to adhesion, which is actually the reason why the sides are bending up. And so you can see that if we zoom in. The water surface down here is obviously held down by gravity. Gravity's pulling on it. But water molecules are actually wanting to stick to the sides of the glass container, in this case a graduated cylinder, and they do that with these little dotted lines here that you can see, and those are, yep, you guessed it, hydrogen bonds that are formed between the partially negative oxygen and the partially positive charge of the glass container. And so the water molecules are actually bending up this way because the water molecules are actually sticking to the glass surface. Okay, it's adhesion. Again, it's due to polarity. It's due to hydrogen bonding. Without polarity, cohesion or adhesion wouldn't happen, but you can definitely see over the course of the last two slides that polarity plays a big role in the properties of water, which are cohesion and adhesion. Capillary action is when you have water molecules pulling other water molecules up very skinny tubes. Okay, so I bring that up because we obviously can't talk about how plants hydrate themselves or how plants get water without talking about a property of water known as capillary action. So capillary action is basically a small diameter tube, and it's water forming a chain to pull itself up the tube. Now, capillary action definitely applies cohesion or adhesion, has cohesion-adhesion application. But if you notice this diagram over here, notice that the diameters of these tubes shrink. This is a larger, this is a little bit smaller, and smallest diameter tube. And you'll notice that the thinner the tube, the smaller the diameter, the actual farther up the water will travel. And it's because gravity has a less effect or a lower effect on thinner amounts of water. And if gravity is interacting kind of less, the interactions between the negative side of the water molecule and the positive side of the glass is stronger and actually imparts more force, which causes the water to draw up this tube. And that's exactly what happens in a plant. Water is going to obviously be in the ground. Water is going to come up through the roots and is going to travel up very tall portions of plants, in the case of trees, to the very tips of leaves where the water will be given off. It's called transpiration. But water often creates a single molecule wide chain where one water molecule is attached to another, which is attached to another, and as one travels up, it pulls the next one with it. And so it creates this long chain of essentially attached water molecules that continually travel up the plant, which is the reason why trees can move large quantities of water without actually having any muscles, without having a heart, which is pumping the fluid around the plant. So, capillary action. If I can progress the slide. And heat capacity. So, heat capacity is another really important property of water. Heat capacity is all about the ability of water to withstand a large amount of change by absorbing a lot of energy. Because we know that water, in the case of like lakes and rivers and oceans, are essentially subjected to large amounts of heat because they're literally sitting out in the direct sun all the time, 24/7, 365, right? And so if the sun is constantly baking the water with large amounts of solar energy, you would expect that energy to be translated to increased water temps. In reality, because water has a relative high heat capacity, it can absorb tons of energy with little rise in temperature. If we took the same amount of solar energy on a beach and we imparted some of that energy to the water and some of that same amount of energy to the sand, if you've been to the beach or if you've been on really hot ground, you would know that there is a huge temperature difference between hot sand and cold sand. So when the sun has been baking the sand or been beating down on the sand all day, there is a large rise in temperature. There isn't, however, a large spike in water temp because of the fact that water has a high heat capacity. So if the starting temp is here and you put a ton of energy in it and it only goes up this much, the difference is literally that. When something has a low heat capacity, the difference is huge, tremendous, right? So there's a large, in fact, this one actually almost tripled in temperature given the same amount of energy that the water had. Okay, that's heat capacity. What does that mean? It is all about hydrogen bonding and the fact that the heat or the energy that is released by the sun and is absorbed by the water is actually kind of breaking or needing to break the hydrogen bonds, and therefore the energy is kind of being used up, so to speak. And so the energy is being used to break hydrogen bonds, which is obviously releasing individual water molecules as water vapor. We call that evaporation, right? But instead of using the energy to heat the water, it's using the energy to release or break the bonds to release the water molecules so that the water molecules or the water doesn't retain heat. Right? Why is that important? It's incredibly important because marine and aquatic organisms or aquatic ecosystems are protected from drastic temperature changes. We don't want those aquatic organisms to be subjected to the same temperature increase that a land animal would be subjected to on a beach, right? Because aquatic organisms literally live in the water. They can't escape the water. And so they're really subjected to the change in temperature, and we do not want that to be drastic. Solutions and suspensions. So one of the important parts of water is that it is the universal solvent. Okay, and so what I mean by that is a solution is made up of a solute and a solvent. Water is the universal solvent, meaning water is really good about dissolving various solutes. One of the reasons why we're made up of so much water, and the reason why blood is kind of that aqueous solution that dissolves a lot of solutes that are beneficial to life, is the fact that water is the predominant ingredient in blood, right? So when we dissolve salt, so to speak, if this is salt and we put it in water, water is a solvent, so it dissolves the solute. Solute would be salt in this case. And water is really good because of the polarity of disassociating these particular individual ions that make up salt. Remember, salt was made by ionic bonding, which we talked about in the first video. But the water is actually going to, because it is partially charged on different poles, is going to attach itself to the different ions because they too are charged. And so if this chlorine ion, which is pulled off of the salt mass, is negatively charged, it's going to bond temporarily to the partially positive side, which, if you remember from the original diagram I showed, the partially positive side would be the hydrogen side. So notice the hydrogen sides are towards the chlorine ion. You can see that right here. Chlorine ion is being bound by the partially positive hydrogen sides of these three molecules. The sodium ion is being held by the partially negative oxygen side because it is positively charged, right? So negative attracts to positive, positive attracts to negative, opposites attract, and that becomes a solution, right? Solution is made up of a solvent and solute, and a solution is all components are evenly distributed. When you dissolve salt into water, those chlorine and sodium ions are evenly distributed throughout the solvent, which in this case was the water, to create the salt solution. A suspension is when some materials do dissolve and some don't, but they separate into pieces that they really don't settle out. So if you put something into water and it really kind of just stays kind of floating and it's hazy and it seems granular, then that's typically a suspension, not a solution. Solutions would be things that kind of went totally clear, right? You don't actually see what was put into the water. Water's polarity gives it the ability to dissolve both ionic and polar molecules. So because these are ions and they were put together via ionic bonding to create salt, salt can then be dissolved by water into the individual ions, and those individual ions are held separated from the mass by the water molecules. That's an ionic compound. Polar molecules like glucose can also be dissolved in water because of the fact that the water is polar and the glucose is polar as well. pH scale. pH scale is the scale we use to measure the acidity or the alkalinity of a substance, and it ranges from 0 being the most acidic to 14 being the most basic or the most alkaline. And so a base is a compound that produces hydroxide ions. We're going to see those a lot throughout biology. OH negative ions are produced by a base. An acid is a compound that releases hydrogen ions into solution. We're going to see tons of instances when an H+ ions are released into solution. Okay, those are released by an acid. So some of the items we have on this scale going from most basic to most acidic would be bleach and household cleaners, literally live up in this region. Okay, very alkaline. Toothpaste is getting closer to the neutral point. Remember, neutral would be 7. Obviously, the difference between 0 and 14 is 7, so that is our neutral point. Toothpaste is just slightly alkaline. Human blood is really close to neutral, but it's just very, very, very tiny bit alkaline. A little bit of pure water is your typical neutral. It can be a little acidic, it can be a little alkaline, depends on what compounds are dissolved in it. Tomato juice would be slightly acidic. Lemon juice or your citrus juices would be even more acidic. And then it gets even closer down in this region when you get into like stomach acid and stuff like that, battery acid. But a buffer is a weak acid or base that can react with strong acids or bases to prevent sharp, sudden changes in pH. So we're going to use buffers sometimes throughout the class and labs, but we definitely need to talk about buffers because we have to talk about maintaining a constant internal condition and maintaining a nice even pH and withstanding large, sudden, sharp changes of pH. And so we can kind of depict that by looking at this picture. If we start with a base that is unbuffered and we put in an acid, it will make the new solution very acidic. Okay? Our ending pH is very acidic. Okay? It's red. It's down here on this scale. However, when we put a buffered base, and remember buffer is a solution that withstands, prevents sharp, sudden changes in pH, if we buffer the base and add the same amount of acid, you're actually going to see that we're going to stay basic. Why is this important? When we talk about living organisms, we want to prevent that living organism from changing the pH drastically because that could have implications that are life-threatening. Okay? So, buffers prevent sudden changes in pH. It helps to make it a little more stable, and it absolutely helps to maintain homeostasis. Really, really important. Okay? So that's where we're going to end it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. Bring your questions to class. Hopefully you took good notes. See ya.